Thank you. That's right. So you're bidding? Your Shudra Beluban, and to all of you, thank you for coming tonight to the Edison Hanoch Yom Hashoah commemoration. This specific day to remember the Holocaust was chosen because it was the date on the Hebrew calendar when the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising started on the 27th of Nisan, April 19th, 1943. This Yom Hashoah marks the 80th anniversary of that event. Many observances for the Holocaust Memorial Day fall on January 27th, the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz in 1945. This day, which is officially Remembrance Day, Yom HaZikaron LaShoah VeLaGvura. We don't dwell on a place that saw millions of Jews murdered, gassed, and incinerated. We remember, mourn, and cry over them, the tragedies that have befallen our people. But we move forward, look ahead, and encourage hope for a better future. We commemorate the Holocaust on this day because it showed unexplainable courage, fierce determination, and extraordinary acts of bravery. May that inspire us onward. We are lucky to have as our guest speaker one of the most inspirational storytellers of our generation, Rabbi Hanoch Teller. A special thank you goes to Dr. Mark Hanfley, who was instrumental in bringing in Rabbi Teller. Also, thank you to Moshe Wiesel and Eben Rogel for their time and effort. I will now call upon our own inspirational leader, Amor Dasra, Rabbi Luban, to begin the program.
Right, first, I want to also thank Dr. Mark Hanfling and Nir Chaim and Maish and Evan that putting together the program. I am so happy to see the crowd here this evening because we are here to give kavod to the Kedoshim that perished during the Holocaust. The shul should really be overflowing, and what we need to try to get the younger people to come as well, so that they should also be connected. But this is a beautiful kavod for the observance of Yom Hashoah. Rabbi Militsky asked me to express his sorrow that he's not here. He's attending the wedding. So Yom Hashoah is Yom HaZikaron. It's a time of remembrance, and we're remembering two things during the Yom Hashoah. We should remember the entire year, and that is, one is the enormous loss that took place during the Shoah, the 6 million Kedoshim, and that number sort of camouflages the fact that they were individuals. When I was in Auschwitz with Peggy and a group of people in the shul, we saw in Auschwitz thousands and thousands of shoes, and every pair of shoes belonged to a person, to an adult, to a child, to a grandparent. We saw suitcases with names of people, and it brought it to life. And every single person who was lost is a world of tragedy. And there were many great people. It was Jewish culture that was destroyed in a short period of time. Hasidim, all sorts of different sects of Hasidim, Misnagdim, Talmidei Chachamim, yeshivos, shuls, outstanding individuals with tremendous religious feeling, and that was just wiped out by the Nazi Yimach Shabam. When we remember, we have two aspects of remembrance in Torah life. One is we say Yizkar every year on Yom Tov because we need to remember the people who are no longer here, because we have to hold on to their memory. We can't just forget them. They are our legacy. They are our inspiration. And we have here this evening Hanoch Teller, a dear friend that I know for many, many years. And he, in general, every single one of his books are phenomenal. He's an eloquent writer and teacher, and he has written a beautiful book on the children of the Holocaust. and it's a tremendous cover for us that the Hanoch is here this evening, and I'm sure he will inspire us to talk about those that cherish. At the same time, we have to remember Zucharis Asher Asol Amalek. We have to remember the evil that befell us by Amalek. There was the Amalek of yesteryear. And there's the modern Amalek, the Nazis, Yom Hashoah, Hitler, Yom Hashoah was Zichro. Their cruelty is beyond human comprehension. I was reading an article yesterday. It talked about how the Nazis would force the children to beat up their parents. They were going to murder the children. They were murder the parents. Why did they have to have the children? Because they wanted to uproot everything that Judaism stood for. Kibbutz Avim. That's one of the most central things. And the torture the children that they and the parents that the children have to beat their parents. The acts of inhumanity just beyond comprehension. And we are very fortunate to have with us Rabbi Dr. Ben Rosenberg, my dear friend. And Ben is the son of the Holocaust survivors. He has literally devoted his entire life to chronicling and recording what happened during the Holocaust. He's the author of many books and plays and Sidurim and Agados and all sorts of things that he's been. That this is teaching. That he's really devoted his life to that, and it's an honor for us to have Ben deliver a short talk at this time.
Thank you, Rabbi Luban, my friend, my mentor, my adopted brother. As I look out in the audience, microphone. Is it on?
It's on. You have to stand closer.
How's this? As I look at you, I want you to know, you two G's, second generation, like me, were only a few years younger than the youngest Holocaust survivors. So since we have such a great speaker tonight, I want to share some stories with you. I will not be long. I was in Florida with my family, and my daughter, Ilana, who does a lot of the research for me regarding my family, was a bit afraid of sharing something with me. She asked me if I could take it, if my heart could take it. When I was very young, about 5 years old, my parents were poor. They spoke Yiddish, and they schlepped me to a Saturday night Kuklish feeling place. Most Greener played cards on Saturday night, right? I'm in another room, and I hear a conversation. My Yiddish at that time was a lot better than it is now. And the conversation was about my father having another wife and other children that were murdered during the Holocaust. I didn't want to believe this, actually, but growing up, I always had this feeling of missing in my heart, of missing something. Ilana brought me this, and she found it through facial recognition, through Yad Vashem. This is my father, as young as I never saw him, with his first wife. With his first wife. Ashtach, you know her. And my message to all of you is keep searching. Keep searching. You may find family that's alive and still here. So we found more information on my father, found some more relatives. Then Ilana went to work, on my mother. And we discovered an entire family, mostly from in Eretz Israel. One of them is a major entertainer by the name of Nitzan. You may have heard of him. So he wrote a piece in Hayom, Israel Hayom. I'm just going to show that family members are, for most of us, a matter of course, not really interesting. When you have parents, siblings, and cousins around you, allowed to love them and fight with them, gossip about them with other relatives, have fun with them on weekends. But when they despair with a trace, it's completely different. A year ago, when the relative search section seemed like a memory from distant days, our family was contacted by a young American woman named Ilana, whose DNA test she conducted revealed strong signs of kinship with our family. I have a first cousin in Israel. It's amazing. I don't have the health yet to try to get to Israel. I also have a new grandchild in Israel. My message to you is very simple. Don't give up the search. There are people still out there that are your relatives. And don't give up. You know, for many years, I've been sharing with you the horrible anti-Semitism that exists. Some of you believe me. Some of you think I was crazy. Whatever. The bottom line is we have more anti-Semitism in this country now than we ever had in this country. And that goes for us also. I want to thank Rabbi Luban, Rabbi Krasansky that's back there, who joins with me in fighting anti-Semitism. It's not easy. I have had dead animals on my lawn, swastikas on my shul, death threats constantly. But it's all worth it because Hashem said it was important to put out the message. So my message, very simply, please join me in this fight. I need you. It is the frum community that's going to lead this fight. Conservative and Reform Judaism is dead. The only part of our people is what you represent. Please fight with me. It is your voice that counts. Thank you. May you have nachas from your children and grandchildren.
Thank you, Ben. That was very meaningful. Thank you, Nir, Brother Luban, Evan, Weiss, anybody who helped us put this program together. My name is Dr. Mark Hampling, and a lot of what Ben said resonated with me. We thank you all for coming tonight. Unfortunately, the number of Holocaust survivors are decreasing. Israel has the highest number, with approximately 150,000 survivors. The average age is 85, and there are 31,000 above the age of 90. The vast majority of the survivors now were children during the Shoah. Holocaust survivors, even though many, such as my father, would not speak about their horrible experiences, they often would ask and plead that we, the Jewish world, not forget the Kedoshim. As second and third generation children and grandchildren of survivors, the task falls to us to perpetuate the memory of those that perished and those that survived. The events leading up to the Holocaust, to the Shoah, the events during the Shoah, and the events after the Shoah, so that we never forget and ensure that it never happens again. In this vein, we undertook the task of instituting this community-wide event focused on remembering through education and commemoration. I could say that I first met Rabbi Hanoch Keller this past summer when Lynn and I toured Yad Vashem with him. but that would not be accurate. I really first met him through reading his books. Rockefeller is a prolific author, storyteller, historian, and educator. He has written 28 books, including Heroic Children, which has 9 stories detailing the accounts of children and their families surviving the Shoah. I strongly recommend you read these amazing and moving stories, but keep a box of tissues handy. In addition to being a prolific author, he has written and produced 2 films, one of which was Reb Elimelech from Lezhensk, and I saw this a few years back at Congregation OE. His knowledge of and the expertise in Holocaust history is manifested by being one of only a few certified tour guides, private tour guides of Yad Vashem. He has spent 2 decades as a tour guide and 2 years doing research on the Heroic Children Holocaust book that he wrote. His sensitivity and presentation of the various exhibits at Yad Vashem are impactful, educational, and tailored to various age groups, as well as educational backgrounds of those who know about the Holocaust. If you enjoy Jewish history, you should listen to his podcast. His podcast, Teller from Jerusalem, presents the history of the formation of the State of Israel and the independence of war. He has a very informative and unique presentation, which includes historical audio clips. In addition to all I've mentioned, he's a sought-after speaker, traveling the globe, and in fact, today he arrived here from South Africa, where he spoke at a Yom Hashoah commemoration there. He's a popular educator, teaching at various seminaries and yeshivot in Israel. He's a jogger in the streets of Yerushalayim, and he has a large family with many children and grandchildren. I thought I was busy, and I don't know how he does it all. My pleasure to present Hanoch Teller.
Thank you very much. After these words, I even want to hear what I have to say. The Shishma Dasra, Rabbi Luban. I say this every time, but I mean it every time. Rabbi Luban, to you as your esteemed and venerable rabbi, that's true. He's also the son of my very gentle and dear neighbor, Rabbi Luban Sr., who sat right next to me in Shul in Yerushalayim. And as much as I missed him, which is endless, when seeing Rabbi Luban, things even more. Thank you, Dr. Hamfling, for being the catalytic enzyme and all those others who helped out. I stand there with many. Okay, so before we get started, let's just talk about the fact that making a program like this is very significant because we commemorate that so important. We know that those who perished wanted nothing more than to be remembered. And that's what we're doing. We're honoring their memory by convening. How do we commemorate is a very tricky question. I'm a tour guide in Yad Vashem. I asked the question, how do we best commemorate 1.5 million children under the age of 12 who perished at the hands of the Nazis, often I'm told schoolyards, playgrounds, which I'm fine with. But I'd also be even finer with more children learning Torah, performing mitzvahs, in lieu of those that cannot. The Gemara says that Mephiskei Melech died, and no one was more responsible for Torah learning than Mephiskei Melech. Midan v'ad Beersheba, from the north all the way to the south. Even the little children knew all the intricate, difficult mishnayos of Taharos. That's a fitting tribute. If we look at the Holocaust as a dead story, a story of our grandparents, our great-grandparents, perhaps our parents, then there's nothing that we can learn regarding the future. We all know the story of how the Aztecs and the Incas were butchered, and it is a dead story. It is no more. I don't mean to sound too sharp, because I will say this Friday in Hallel, Lo hamesim yehaleluka. Again, without trying to sound too sharp, without life, death has no future.
The sacrifice of the martyrs was not in vain if we inculcate their memory, ensure the future of our people, the state of Israel, the values which they held so dear. This much at least we owe to them. Then the question, how do we do this? There's a story about the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement, that he was able to go to a particular spot in the forest, recite a specific formula, and an angel appeared. One generation later, they knew where the forest was, and they knew where the specific spot was, but they didn't know the formula, and an angel did not appear. And one generation later, they knew about the forest, they didn't know the formula nor the specific spot. And us, we don't even know where the forest is. So what do we have in the grandeur and the sublimity of the Baal Shem Tov? And the answer is, we have everything, because we have the story, and the story brings us back. So we recount so that we can remember. In many Pesach Starim, it is common that after telling the Maggid and how he had suffered, at the end of the Haggadah, the grandparents, the grandmother, the grandfather gets up and they relate their story, how they managed to survive, how they had been betrayed and how they had suffered. And they pass on their survival and their story to the next generation. And I want to make this personal. When I grew up, I'm 27, but why is that funny? When I grew up, we saw a lot of numbers engraved on the flesh. I wonder how many numbers my children have seen, and if my grandchildren have seen any at all. In this regard, I wish to relate 3 stories. Erev Yom Kippur is the most crowded day in the men mikvah. My mikvah, my neighbor in Yerushalayim, it's a very devout religious neighborhood. And the mikvah is so boisterous and noisy. It's all Chassidim, Yerushalmim, and everyone's on top of each other. And And I cannot describe the story delicately because in the mikvah, there's no way to conceal because everything is revealed. And everyone's on top of each other wishing B'T Yosef B'T. And there was one kid from across the street from the Ohr Torah Yeshiva for beginners. How do I know it's from Ohr Sameach? It said on his t-shirt, Ohr Sameach Wrestling. I'm just joking. Clearly, he was not a chassid nor a Jerusalemite. He had an earring and a ponytail. And he felt very much out of place in this mikvah. And the people in the mikvah are not especially subtle, about as subtle as heavy metal is subtle. And they're gawking and gaping. This poor kid is highly embarrassed, about to step into the pool. And then he slips and trips and grabs the rail. And there's this roaring silence in the mikvah, sphinx-like silence. Picture a forest after a tree is felled. Imagine the Mudville Stadium after Mighty Casey struck out. And no one is moving. Before so boisterous and noisy, and now it's as if we went deaf. No one is moving. It turns alabaster as these broad, bloody tattoos are flying through the air. I shall not describe them to you. They were not anchors. In my life, I have never witnessed such embarrassment. And so I'm cogitating, he'll jump into the pool and he'll never come out. At that point, an elderly neighbor of mine, the story happened over 25 years ago. An elderly neighbor of mine walked across the moist marble floor. This story happened nearly 30 years ago. And I can still hear in my ears the whack, 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 as my neighbor goes across to this boy with a tattoo. And he says to him this heavily Yiddishy, European accent in English. He said, "Don't fool me, young man. I also have a tattoo." Pointed numbers going up his flesh. In other words, I went through my Gehenna. You went through your Gehenna. Let's begin Yom Kippur together. Spontaneous everyone over, wishing a good year and a Shana Tova. I saw how one small thing can make all the difference in the world. Secondly, I have a friend. To be more accurate, my friend has a friend. He's a friend of my friend. He was a psychiatrist in Manhattan. And he wrote in the in Washington Heights in the 1950s, where it was very prevalent to see people with numbers engraved on their flesh. In the summer, they would vacation in the Rockaways, and there you saw them everywhere. So much so that my friend said to his mother when he was 9 years old, "When am I going to get my number?" She forced her to run out of the kitchen crying. Now, this fellow, Ike, his grandfather, was a physician in the Catskill Mountains. And his aunt, the doctor's wife, was his receptionist. One day she calls home and says, "Ike, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein is coming to the clinic this Sunday. Would you like to meet him?" What kid who grew up in Washington Heights in the 1950s wouldn't give the right arm to meet Rabbi Moshe Feinstein? So he scrubs his face, puts on his yontif finery, and he's sitting in the waiting room looking as religious as he possibly can. Hajja, 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 hajja. And one person after another person after another person after another person walk in, and it gets fuller, fuller, fuller. And finally, Reb Moshe with his entourage walks in, and his aunt runs over to Reb Moshe and she says, "Rabbi Feinstein, I'm very sorry, but we have a lot of people here. You're gonna have to wait your turn." And she plants a kiss on both of his cheeks. Ike melts into the floorboards. When he can finally emerge, he crawls out. And he says with his halting Yiddish to Rav Moshe, "Anshuldik Rav Moshe, mein Tante ist nicht der Fromme." Pardon me, my aunt, she's not a religious woman. She doesn't know any better. Rav Moshe said, "Shh, she's got the numbers. She's holier than I." And lastly, he asked the Satmar Rebbe, "Where should we go, Rebbe? When the Rebbe will no longer be here, we wish to get a bracha, and get a blessing." He said, "Go to shul." And you see someone putting on the tefillin, and you see the numbers on the wrist. That is their affidavit to Shemayim. From such an individual, you may seek a blessing. But we're going to skip a little bit, not that you would know. You know, it was pertinent last night in Pretoria where we spoke. Idea of witnesses. Elie Wiesel has this line that if you meet a survivor, then you are a survivor, which means we're all endowed with this holy mission if we have to discharge. So in the limited time that I have, and I'm grateful for every minute, I want to begin with before the war and end at the end of the war. Before the war, we have the story of the voyage of the St. Louis, May 1939. On board are 937 Jewish passengers, all of them with legitimate paperwork to go to Cuba, and also have able to pay for the passage. At this point, the German Jewry was totally bankrupt financially. They were totally impoverished, like grinding poverty, because after Kristallnacht, the Jewish community was fined with 1 billion Reichmarks to pay for the damage. So they could afford this travel. They were the wealthiest of German Jews. They arrive and dock in Cuba, Havana, Cuba. 937 passengers. Of these passengers, 736 have legitimate visas to go to America, but they will only be valid in 3 months' time. So when they arrive and they dock, and you look up and see the passengers, at this point, the Cubans want the bride. I'll bet you that one of the first words you learn in Spanish is el bribo. So if they want the bride, what should you do? Let's try that again. Nearly 1,000 Jews, their lives are on the line. They need to get in and they need a bride. What should you do? Obviously, pay the bride. As they say in Staples, that was simple. But the leader of American Jewry, his name was Rabbi Stephen S. Wise, whom we used to call Hagai Hagadol Hazeh. Rabbi Wise was the quintessential Reform rabbi with crop of hair, well-built, stage presence, oratorical abilities, cushy with FDR, Eleanor, members of the cabinet. A bribe's against the law. We can't violate the law. And the irony of ironies was, had somehow they got into Cuba and then required millions for housing and education, they would have come up with the money, but not to violate the law. The captain of the ship, Gustav Schroeder, a German, was a benevolent, magnanimous humanitarian. They figured, well, America's a humane country. Surely America will take them. I interject for a second to introduce to you a person you're probably not familiar with. You haven't heard the name of James G. McDonald. James G. McDonald was very modestly in FDR's cabinet, not cabinet, in his administration, person who fought all his life to save Jews. And so he came up with the idea that why don't they go to the Virgin Islands? It's right there in the hood, American territory. So FDR responded in the name of the Secretary of State, Gordon Hull, who was quite an elderly gentleman. Some say he was senile at this point. The Southerner, Tennessean, didn't have a lot of sympathy for refugees. And he explained the ultimate catch-22. The only way we let in refugees would be if you have a country to go back to. These Jews were denied their citizenship in Germany. Therefore, we can't let them in as refugees because they don't have a country to return to. And there wasn't a country on the face of the earth willing to take them. Captain Schroeder steamed his boat up and down the eastern seaboard. And how did America react? With a Coast Guard cutter to intercept. Had somehow they got off and swam the 20 miles to Miami, had this been doable, they would have been returned. In the end, there wasn't a country on the face of the earth willing to accept them. They went back where they came from. Many perished in the Holocaust. Which raises the question, what could have been done? So if you're not familiar with the Musi negotiations, which means you don't read enough telebooks, but more about that later. On the table towards the end of the war are between the 60 and 800,000 Jews still alive in the camps. Jean-Marie Musi was a former Swiss president, Nazi sympathizer, and a good chum of Himmler. Himmler was a very dangerous man. He was the top cop in Germany, but Himmler was much more pragmatic than Hitler, and he wanted to save his skin, so he negotiated. Negotiations began in New York with the Baron Cutler, negotiating with the Sternbach family in Switzerland, and they negotiated with Jean-Marie Musi. So at first, Himmler demanded medicine and trucks, which the Vahatzala could not come up with. He then changed his demand, Vahatzala not to be confused with the ambulance corps, to go to the corps of activists and rescue workers based in New York that worked around the clock, undermanned, underfinanced, and understaffed. Then he changed his demand, Himmler, from the trucks and medicine to 5 million francs, or the equivalent of $1 million. Precisely 1 million more than the Vahatzala had. However, the Joint Distribution Committee, the JDC, did have $1 million. So Baron Cutler, the classic Lithuanian Rosh Hashiva, long, frock coat, short, stooped. Looking at him, you could not tell how clever he was. He looked arcane, svarim under the hand. He went before the joint. He did not converse in English. He spoke Yiddish. And Irving Bunim, the head of Young Israel, was his translator. He went before the joint and he said, we need $1 million. And the leader of the joint said, we can't do it. We can't do it because it means violating the British blockade, which was sacrosanct. And it's after Pearl Harbor. It means trading with the enemy, which is a felonious crime. And for all I know, it's a treasonous crime. But to the Gedolim, to the great rabbis of America, it is despicable to violate American law. And it's odious to give money to the Nazis. And yet, there's a higher law. And the higher law is pikuach nefesh, to save a life. And the higher law is pidyon shvuyim, to rescue a captive. And the higher law is lo ta'amod adam re'ach. Don't stand by your brother's blood. And the higher law is arvut's responsibility, one Jew towards his brother. And Baron Cutler begs and pleads, cajoles and wheedles, and he will not give in. And he continues to beg and to wheedle, and finally, he says, okay, we'll give you the money provided you get a license from the American government. We can give $1 million to the Nazi enemy. There's only one person in all of America who'll be authorized to give this license. And that, of course, was the president, named after the highway in Manhattan. By the way, we ask a Jew in the 30s who was a Jewish leader, who's a leader, they would say in Yiddish, it's the drei Welt. There are three worlds. Der Welt, jener Welt, and Rosa. This world in the same breath, Olam Haba, and Rosa. So they traveled to Washington, and apparently Roosevelt felt that the plight of 800,000 Jews was not important enough for his time. He sends him to his hyper-assimilated Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Morgenthau Jr. And you can imagine, being a secretary in FDR's cabinet, you have to be an extremely assimilated Jew, which he was. He and his wife celebrated Christmas and Easter. There's something very Jewish ticking in that heart. He goes before him, he says, we need $1 million to save 800,000 Jews still alive in the camps. Now, this question is such a no-brainer. It would have been the greatest rescue effort in the history of history. Borscht Billy, for $1 million to save 800,000. But Morgenthau says, I cannot authorize $1 million of taxpayer money to go to the Nazis. And again, Rav Aaron Kotler begs and he pleads and he cajoles and he wheedles and he begs and he appeals. And at one point, Henry Morgenthau Jr. collapses on the table like this for what appears to be an eternity. When he finally raises his head, his eyes are deltas red, cascading down his cheeks. Tell the rabbi, I've not forgotten who I am, and I'll put my neck on the chopping block to save my brethren. And Henry Morgenthau Jr. will go down in history, so he was willing to risk his career and his life on behalf of his brethren. Ultimately, the plan was scuttled by American jury, a Swiss jury, and Hitler himself intervened to make sure it wouldn't happen. But in life, the take-home message is so obvious. In life, we have to make decisions. You make the convenient one, that is the way that you'll be forgotten. You make the difficult one, that is the way you'll be remembered. And we do want to remember. We want to remember those who did try and make efforts on our behalf. In Yad Vashem, there's an apartment the size of, from the Mechitza across, this way. Department of Righteous Gentiles, from the beginning of Yad Vashem. Over the years, it's had hundreds of volunteers scouring the world to try and find those who risked their lives and those of their families to save Jewish lives. In Yad Vashem, there is Schindler's List. I don't mean the film, I mean Schindler's List, the list. And on that list, number 173 is Leopold Pfefferberg. Pfefferberg was one of Schindler's Yidden, and he was convinced that it was Schindler who saved his life. He came to America after the war, Americanized his name to Leon Page, and he was determined to get someone to write the story of Oskar Schindler. He moved to Beverly Hills, where he had a leather goods store. And in LA, there are so many script writers and producers and assistant producers, and yet he couldn't get anyone to write the story. One day, an Australian novelist, Thomas Keneally, innocently walked into his leather goods store to buy a leather briefcase, and he couldn't get the credit card to work. Till he could get Sidney on the phone, it took half an hour. And Pfefferberg unspooled himself, telling him the story of Schindler. And Keneally was intrigued. He delayed his flight and spent the night over Pfefferberg's house. That resulted in Schindler's List. But Pfefferberg wasn't done. Through one of his customers, he got the phone number of Steven Spielberg, the famous producer and director. And he called him every single week, telling him, you must make a film about Oskar Schindler. Spielberg had just finished directing Jurassic Park. And Pfefferberg said to him, stop spieling with the dinosaurs. Make a film about Schindler. Make a film about Oskar Schindler, and I guarantee you an Oscar for Oscar. And as you know, it won 7 Oscars. I don't even remember what time. I just came up a long flight We should go the full 3 hours. I want to say something which I've never said before, and that is it's an opportunity to get up in front of a chashuv ha'olam and try and untarnish the reputation of those martyrs who were accused in derision of why didn't they fight back? Why did they go like sheep to the slaughter? The assumptions behind these questions are somewhat ridiculous. If you were in a labor battalion of 10 and one escaped, what happened to the other 9? They were not killed. They were murdered. This is a very important distinction. You don't want to let off the murderers on a lighter than they deserve. If you're driving your car, Khalil, and you run someone over, you've killed them. What the Seres Dibros forbids is the Seres murder. That's what they engaged in. If one Jew would escape the ghettos and join the partisans easily, 1,000 could be rounded up and mowed down. Now, for escape to work, for resistance to work, you have to have a local group of people that can assist you, that can shelter you. Jews from Poland and Ukraine understood very well there wasn't a Pole that would give them shelter or hide them or provide for them. And the Nazis engaged in subterfuge, verbal camouflage, and all these sophisticated methods of deception and concealment. The victims had no way to discover what lay in store for them. All armed resistance in the Holocaust, bar none, were only done when the Jews realized that they were doomed. And as a rule, this always happened much too late. There are films in Yad Vashem of people going onto the trucks and the trains to the death camps, and you see them fighting to get onto the train. The fight is because they were promised they're going to work in the harvest. Now, what Jew wants to work in a harvest? But anything, not to be sent back to the ghetto. The German genius is always making the worst worse. And invariably, when they left the ghettos, there was physical relief. We're going to go now and be reunited with our families. Only one Jew survived Belz. That's one of the extermination camps. And this is his testimony. When they arrived in the camp, there was very bucolic lyrical music, which was playing like Vienna Woods, waltzes. And as this officer stood on a platform, said, "My friends, welcome to Belzitz. You're going to love it here. But before we give you a meal, please be kind enough to take off your clothing so we can have it sanitized." Could anything make a person feel more secure than having their clothing sanitized? But please do this quickly so that the coffee doesn't get cold. And what did the Jews do when they said this? They applauded. The clothing came off, then came out the spears, pitchforks, truncheons, and drove them, what was called Himmelstrasse, the road to heaven, one way into the gas chamber. So Jews who had been beaten, who had been starved, who were exhausted, saw the rabbis humiliated, the Sefer Torah desecrated. They thought nothing could be worse than what they had experienced in the ghettos. The fact that they could take with them their luggage, small luggage, only enhanced within them the idea that they weren't being sent to their death. Many Jews, before being put into the gas chamber, were forced to write postcards at night at rifle points, extolling how wonderful conditions were, how good the schools were, how intriguing the food is. Signed Beryl, Schmerl, Bubby, people you knew, handwriting you recognized, and they were postmarked from desirous locations. And so because copies were so effective and misleading, escape was rarely attempted. And the Polish and Ukrainian Jews knew for sure they'd never be able to escape because the Poles would not offer them shelter. Invariably, the Nazis did their executions under subterfuge and artifice, always planting rumors that desperate people wish to hear. I'm not mistaken, the term in psychology is denial. The Jewish mind could not comprehend what was happening to it. Whereas it's referred to in basketball, this was an uneven matchup. And not because the Nazis had all the might and the Jews did not. Because Jews are thinking about soup kitchens and engaging in chesed. The Nazis are always thinking of more and more horrendous forms of torture. The Jews believed that as long as they were productive, it made no sense for the Nazis to destroy them. They had already lost most or all of their family, their naked skeletons. They'd seen so much, experienced so much. The very idea of a shower disguised as a gas chamber, or a gas chamber described as a shower, was, in a word, unbelievable. The last words they heard, if they could even hear it, were, "Ivan, turn on the water." The Polish Jews, they had experienced this torture for 2 years before being sent out to their deaths. I want to just tell you one story about resistance, and then I'll come to my conclusion. Very rabbinic to end several times. I had a teacher, my Menayel Yeshiva in Stanford, Rav David Hirschmeyer. His mother, her name was Edison Meyer, Leah Meyer. Very pious woman. She was in a labor camp in Austria, highly expecting, and she davened, she prayed every day that it shouldn't be a boy. For be a boy, you should have the problem of arranging a brisk circumcision. I can assure you, most people in camps are not worried about this, but this, and only this, was on her mind. And the woman had such incredible faith. She took the slop that was fed to her, buried it into the ground. So in fact, to be a boy, perhaps you could manufacture, cook, produce something out of it, and serve it at the Sudat Mitzvah, at the festive meal on the day of the circumcision. God played a little trick, and a baby boy was born. And then, miracle of miracles. On the 8th day, a transport arrived in the camp, and on the transport was the male, the circumciser from her village in Hungary. She was ecstatically happy. She said, "Must be brought your knife for Mila," but he had not. Said, "No," she said, "must be you made a mistake." But how could you make a mistake with those few legal possessions you're allowed to bring with you? Such an important Rebbe in her honor. He looked, and sure enough, he had brought the knife for Mila. Performed the bris, and she held up her little baby and said, "Menashe, don't cry. I've denied your proper bris, but with God's help, I'll yet provide a proper bar mitzvah." And 13 years later in Williamsburg, Williamsburg of then, Williamsburg in the 50s, Hasidic Williamsburg, there's more drinks and schnapps that can fill lakes and oceans and rivers, and schmaltzer and gefilte fish that can fill vats and tubs, and kishke and kugel that can fill auditoriums and plazas, and everyone's eating and drinking and merry. And Menashe gets up, delivers bar mitzvah drashas shetel. Just then, this elderly gentleman walks into the back of the room, malodorous, odorific, or stunken, redolent, but eyes that are chipped from agate. He walks right up in the front of the room, and good old Williamsburg style begins to clink out a soda bottle. Menashe, Menashe was trying to quiet down this intruder. Menashe, Menashe. One gentleman, a little more enterprise than the other, passed a bottle of schnapps, but he can't be dissuasive. Everybody say, "Ladies and gentlemen, you think you're here to attend a bar mitzvah? You're mistaken. In fact, you're here to attend a bris." At this point, the hook is out, and they wish to hear the end of the story. So, everybody say, 13 years ago, we were deep in hell, denied, deprived, beaten, and tortured every day. It was your mother who reminded us who we are, and indeed who we should be. You think what you're eating now is tasty? I want you to know that little something your mother served at your Sudas mitzvah was more geschmack and heavenly than paradise itself. If she can maintain this there, how much more so we are? Life is hard, but that's the way that's configured. So I wrote this story. I'm 27, maybe 30 years ago. And 12 years ago, my son was married in Williamsburg. I know there's a difference in New Jersey and Williamsburg, but in New York, as you probably know, Williamsburg has become the wedding capital of New York. And 12 years ago, I'm about to walk my son down to the chuppah. I'm literally about to walk my son down to the chuppah. And then a man comes over to me that I never saw before. Chassidus Yid with all the trappings, langer rekel, bulletproof stockings, a hat, large enough to be a shiloh of Ohel on Shabbos, salt and pepper, salt. He says to me 3 words. Had I not held on to the rail for sure, I would have fainted. He says to me, he knew who I was. I did not know who he was. He said to me, Ich bin Menashe. He's the baby I wrote about. Listen to this resistance. This woman built a family of tzaddikim and chassidim. And this we may never, ever forget. And really, really to conclude, I also wanted to make a contribution toward the Holocaust. The fact of the matter is that the Holocaust is the most documented crime in history. There's not much you can write about that's not already been written. But it occurred to me that there's just one thing that still had not been spoken about. When the war was over, everyone was eager to relate their story and how they've been abandoned and betrayed. People could not talk then, basically have not spoken, are the children. So I traveled around the world to discover I wanted to discover the stories of children. That's right. So I traveled the world, and if you're age to us, and you know that people for the children did everything they could to try and forget what happened. And then when I began to gather stories, and I had some fantastic stories, it was clear to me, with my knowledge of history and what happened, these stories cannot be accurate. The people did not mean to change, but just over time, their minds played tricks on them. But we managed to gather 9 stories and compile them in heroic children, and it's a riveting way of studying the Holocaust. By reading the stories of children, seeing it through their perspective. And after 16 years of draconian work on this book, we finally were about to go to press. We had a very draconian deadline. We're about to go to press, and we forgot something rather important, which is we didn't have a cover for the book. I always say, whoever said they don't judge a book by its cover, I know they never tried to sell a book. So we needed a cover for the book, so I put my team on it. That means my children, 18 children. So they're going through all the pages there are of pictures. They came across this picture. I don't know if you can see it in the distance. It's a remarkable picture, a picture that was shot on the day that Auschwitz was liberated. It's a picture of hundreds of children. This is zoomed in on just a few. And to use a picture as a picture, to use it as a cover of a book, you need permission. So I sent off a request to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, which are the copyright holder, requesting permission to use their picture as the cover of the book. And when you fill out a form, you have to fill out an affidavit that you're not going to make any changes, you're not going to zoom, you're not going to alter, you're not going to color. And I said, I'm going to make this change and this change and that change and this change and this change and this change and that change and this change. And the next day, I had permission. However, they sent it to me low resolution, and I'll have it in high resolution in 3 weeks. 3 weeks. Everyone knows that to turn a picture from low res to high res takes 3 seconds, not 3 weeks. But the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum is a large bureaucracy, over 300 employees. And you'll pardon me for being an Israeli, but I figure what's necessary here is protection. Having the right connections. So I have a friend in Baltimore, a very powerful person. They say that in his cell phone, he has every senator and congressman's private number. And his son was learning in yeshiva right next door to me in Jerusalem. So I run to the yeshiva and said, Aryeh, thinking this is a total rhetorical question, Aryeh, is your father connected to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington? And as you all know, Baltimore, Washington is like Edison and Highland Park. So he says to me, no. Disenchanted, crestful, and melancholy. I'm walking out, and just about to cross the threshold. And he says to me, but my mother is on the board. I'm about to wring his neck. His mother is a judge, Chaya Friedman. I sent her an email, I said, Chaya, I desperately need your help. I need this picture. I give her the lot number, the phone number. And I said, I need it, high res. Next day, I have the picture. Then I think to myself, 1 second. My methodology in guiding in Yad Vashem is always to highlight the individual. And anytime in Yad Vashem, there are dozens of tours going on. Yad Vashem was made to be guided. And you'll hear guides unspooling data that the head cannot absorb. We're talking about over 15 countries, over 6 years, different regime. It's just too much information. So what I do is I tell a personal story, and from there, I pull out the information. So what I want to do in sync with my methodology, I do not know if you can see from the distance. This picture is sepia. I wanted to highlight and color one child as he looked at the time. But for something like this, I certainly need permission. So I write back, I said, dear judge, I said, please get me permission to highlight this child. She writes me back that she's in the middle of convening a murder trial and she has no time. So I wrote her, Chaya, this is killing me. And I prevailed upon her. The next day she writes back, yay, yay. I tried. I cannot tell you they're going to agree. I'm thinking to myself, who's going to say no? This is the Holocaust. It's apple pie, it's mom, it's the flag, it's everything. And I had that night, I'll use the technical term, a press queue in the largest press in Israel, arguably in the Middle East. By 10 o'clock that night, we'll have 10,000 covers. 3 hours before press queue, I get an email from the head archivist, United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington. It's actually just 2 minutes and 2 hours and 48 minutes. Dear Rabbi Tucker, we regret to inform you, you may not use the picture. If you wish to use the picture in its pristine state, no zooming, no enlarging, no coloring, then you may. But once you make the slightest change, you may not. And particularly because regarding this boy, our legal department said unequivocally you may not, because he recently spoke out. He's very sensitive. Shrek and a half. But I'm not such a pushover, a bit of a fighter. So I write back right away, please send me his phone number and his name. I'd like to speak with him. 1 hour and 36 minutes to press queue. She writes back, we don't know his name. We don't know where he lives. I said, Papa, you just told me that he's sensitive, he spoke out. 56 minutes to press queue. She sends me an online clipping of this picture, of the people in this picture, then, of course, in the grips of old age, returning to Auschwitz on the 7th anniversary of the liberation, pointing to themselves as youngsters in the picture. It was apparent, I'm going to use the yeshivish term, it was mashma from this article, not explicit, it was mashma that this boy's name is Hirsch. Now, I don't know if that's his first name or his last name. And if he is Hirsch, it said Hirsch lives in Europe. So now I have 23 minutes to find Hirsch in Europe. I eliminate England, eliminate Russia, that's Eurasia. And you look at the kid, if you can see, the kid looks pretty good. So I knew he couldn't be a Pole. Pole could never look this good. He'd have to be Hungarian. Hungary was invaded March 1944. To be in this shape, he'd have to be Hungarian. So Sherlock Teller is thinking to himself, where in the world would a Hungarian survivor of Auschwitz live in Europe today? And I concluded it had to be either Belgium or Switzerland. Then I remembered I have a close friend in Switzerland who works for IBM. What a shidduch. So my friend, now it's 11 minutes to press your call. My friend Moshe Loser said, Moshe Loser, I need you to find me Hirsch in Switzerland. So he said, is that his first name or his last name? I said, I don't know. He said, is he religious? I said, I don't know. And then he said, Hanoch, what have you been drinking? I'm not drinking anything. I got 9 minutes to find this guy. You know what? I'm sure he's Hungarian. Try Gavor or Tibor Hirsch. That's Hungarian equivalent of Mike or Steve. So he types in the computer and I hear, and he says, Gavor Hirsch, 89-year-old engineer. Here's his phone number. I call him up, my Hochdeutsch, I speak to him, he gives me permission, and I race off an email to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. I have permission to use the picture. You don't believe me, here's his phone number, but it's already 9 o'clock in Switzerland. An elderly gentleman, I wouldn't call him tonight. I happen to have a beautiful picture, which I should have thought of bringing, of Hirsch holding this book. Hirsch passed away this year, holding this book with such pride. I took that as an omen. We managed to locate Gabor Hirsch in Switzerland on one phone call. That would take me, it would take me hours just to parallel park, and it took me just phone call to find him. I took that as an omen for the book, which is really making a difference in people around the world. One story which I share with you just from this week, last week. Last week, I guided a church group in Yad Vashem. They're from Beaufort, South Carolina. For those of you not familiar, the United States Marines are divided by the Mississippi. The West Coast, their headquarters are in San Diego. The East Coast is Paris Island, Beaufort, South Carolina. And I've spoken to Beaufort before. There's 450 of these books that have been sold in Beaufort, South Carolina. So one colonel got his hands on this book, and he said to me, he was in the church group, that before he deploys his troops in Afghanistan or Iraq, he makes them read this book. And what they get from this book is more than months of training in the Marines. In any event, thank you very, very much. Outside, you'll find the books. I think you'll find them in rich names. And I will.
Wait 1 minute. We're privileged through the efforts of Josh Krasinski and the Rock Organization to have with us here the mayor of Edison. And we're close to Highland Park, but not the same distance as Teller mentioned. Anyway, we'd like to welcome him. Thanks for coming. And I'd like to say a couple of words. One other thing I'd like to mention is that pretty exciting is that from what I understand, a member of our own congregation is now going to be part of the election process for Edison Council.
Thank you. I'm truly humbled and honored to be here right now. I've gone to several Holocaust remembrance events over the past few years, and for some reason, I just always get slated right after the guest speaker, the keynote speaker, which puts me in a very difficult position because I'm just not as eloquent, but it's very humbling. I want to say once again, thank you for having me here today, but I want to express the importance of today and understanding and recognizing that in Edison Township, we have an extremely unique opportunity, which we are, I'll say in Edison and also in Middlesex County, we are one of the most diverse communities in the entire United States of America. And that's something that we should all have a sense of pride in, because it allows us to be in a community, in a neighborhood where we can understand one another's backgrounds, and also, most importantly, respect one another. That is extremely important. That's something that I'm trying to stress through my policies as well in Edison Township. I want to give a personal story that really touched my life and myself and my wife's life when we learned more about the Holocaust. Obviously, growing up in the school system, you always learn about it. But when we went to Italy last year, it was actually our honeymoon. We went to Italy last year, and we get out on the very first day. We were told to go this way, walk this way. So we do. And it happens to be the historical Jewish ghetto neighborhood. And we're walking through it. And one of the areas that we went to had this story. I'll give you a very abbreviated version of it, which was a young couple who became targeted. They just had a baby. They were just newly married. They just had a baby. And they became targeted. They realized very quickly that they would have to give that baby up in order to save its life. And so they did. They gave it up to the neighbor. They fled. They went on their way. The father was later killed. And that neighbor raised that child for many years. Fast forward about 20 years later, that child reconnected with the mother, who was the only survivor from that family. Again, I'm giving you an abbreviated version, but what I learned in that moment was very simple, that hate does not discriminate. Myself and my wife, we do not have kids yet. And what we did learn is that the position that they were in at that moment was, quite frankly, no different from any young couple just starting out. But they were subjected to hate caused by simple rhetoric, and it inflamed. It made us both realize that we can't stress enough the importance of pushing back against hate. We can't stress enough the importance of recognizing where we came in history and all the things that history has taught us. The Holocaust was the worst event, the most tragic event that happened in humanity. It cannot be understated, cannot be overstated. We have to go out of our way to make sure that we remember these stories, similar to how I just shared right now, and remember that it could happen. We have to push back against hate. When I came to the RPRY school last year, I was so taken aback at seeing the stories from Holocaust survivors. And I say the entire time, one-on-one accounts with the students and what they did to interview Holocaust survivors. And as we all know, there's not that many left anymore, but it's very important to remember these stories. I want to make sure that in Edison Township, we acknowledge these stories, but more importantly, learn how to prevent them in the future. Because it's a fabric of who we are. We have to be better as a society than others before us. I said then, and I will reiterate again, that exhibit or anything like that, should someone want within this community or within the Jewish community in general, want to display it in an exhibit within Town Hall, in City Hall, by all means, please reach out to my office. Because I think it is so important that we do that. I think it's important that when people come in, they recognize that, one, we are a very welcoming community here in Edison Township. That is the policy that we're laying out. And we're going to have the backs of every community, because hate will not be tolerated anywhere. Similarly, I also said this before, and I will say again, we've never raised the Israeli flag in Edison Township. We're more than happy to do that. I want to do that. I want to recognize. I say that because as rhetoric across the country, across the world can so quickly turn vile, we have to push back on it. We have to recognize that within Edison Township, we are better than this. We will not allow hatred. We remember what history has taught us, and we will be better. Thank you for having me here today. I'm so humbled to be here.
Now we call upon Cantor Avi Siegel to say the Kelmale and the Tikva.
אל מלא רחמים, שוכן מרומים, המצי מנוחה נכונה על כנפי השכינה, במעלות קדושים וטובים, כזוהר כי המזים את נשמות אחינו בני ישראל, הקדושים והטהורים, שנפלו בידי הרוצחים, ונשפך דמם באושוויץ מדניק, טרבלינקה ובשאר מחנות השמד באירופה, שנהרגו, שנשחטו, שנשרפו, ושנטבעו ושנחנקו על ידי קידוש השם, בעבור שכל הקהל הקדוש הזה מתפללים ביד להזכרת נשמתם, בגן עדן תהי מנוחתם לכן בעל החמים, יסתירם אשא כנפיך לעולמים, וצרור מצרור החיים את נשמתם, אדוני הוא נחלתם, וינוחו עמיש כבשם בשלום, אמן. כל עוד בלב פנימה נפש יהודי הומייה, ולפתי מזרח קדימה, עין לציון צופיה. עוד לא אבדה תקוותנו, התקווה בת שנות 2000, להיות עם חופשי בארצנו ארץ ציון ירושלים, להיות עם חופשי בארצנו ארץ ציון וירושלים.
Here, they said in 5 minutes.
That concludes the program. There'll be Marav in the best letters in the back in 5 minutes.